pastor noticed it first. Not the police, not the medical examiner, not the neighbors, the pastor. He had officiated at Mark Staudte's funeral in April 2012. He had sat with Diane Staudte in the weeks after her husband's death in the way pastors do, bringing comfort, listening, watching. He had noticed something then, something that he filed away without fully naming. When Shaun Staudte died 5 months later, in September of the same year, the pastor noticed it again. And when Sarah Staudte was rushed to the hospital in June 2013 with organ failure and a brain bleed, he picked up the phone. He called the Springfield Police Department and said he believed Diane Staudte had committed 2 or 3 homicides. That call was the only reason anyone looked. Because until that moment, 2 people in the same family had died within 5 months of each other and been buried without a serious question asked. The medical examiner had attributed Mark's death to natural causes. Shaun's death had been attributed to complications from prior medical issues. Nobody had connected them. Nobody had been looking for a connection. The Staudte family of Springfield, Missouri had simply suffered what looked, from the outside, like terrible consecutive misfortune. A husband, then a son, dead within a single year. The kind of grief that makes a community bring casseroles and say things about God's plan, and eventually, slowly, move on. What was actually happening inside that house was something that the community, the medical system, and the legal system had all failed to see. Diane Staudte had been poisoning her family with antifreeze, not commercial antifreeze. She and her daughter Rachel had researched the distinction online and understood that standard antifreeze sold in stores contained a bittering agent, a chemical additive specifically designed to make the product taste unpalatable, added in most commercial formulations to prevent accidental ingestion by children or animals. They had found a source on the internet that sold antifreeze without the bittering agent. They had ordered it deliberately, specifically because they believed it would be tasteless in a drink. They had been right. There is something in the specificity of that research that investigators found as disturbing as the act itself. This was not impulsive violence. This was not a moment of rage resolved in a way that couldn't be taken back. This was a woman sitting at a computer, typing questions about how to kill someone undetected, reading the answers, making a purchase decision, and waiting for the package to arrive. The gap between thinking about killing your family and doing these specific preparatory steps is wide enough that a person crosses it only by moving through it deliberately, one decision at a time. Ethylene glycol, the active compound in antifreeze, does not show up in a standard toxicology screen. It requires specific testing to detect. Unless a medical examiner has a specific reason to test for it, the cause of death will be recorded as something else. Organ failure, seizure activity, complications from existing conditions, which is exactly what happened. Twice. Springfield, Missouri sits in Greene County in the southwestern part of the state, in a region of the Ozarks where conservative Midwestern values and tight community networks define ordinary life. The Staudte family was unremarkable by every surface measure. A middle-aged couple, 4 children, a modest house on a street full of modest houses. The kind of family that exists in every city in the country. Invisible in the way that ordinary families are invisible. Present at church, present at school events, not notable in any direction. Mark Staudte, 61 years old, had been a musician. He played in a blues band, a detail that surfaces in the records like a small human fact trying to survive the weight of what came after. He had been overweight. He had been unhealthy. He had been, by Diane's account, someone she had long since stopped wanting to be married to. Diane was 50 years old, heavy-set, a church-going woman who described herself to investigators as deeply unhappy for a very long time. What that unhappiness looked like from the outside is something the community struggled to articulate after the arrests. Neighbors said the family had seemed normal. The pastor, when he finally made the call, was not reporting obvious abuse or documented conflict. He was reporting a feeling, The accumulated observation of a woman at 2 funerals who did not grieve in the way that grief typically presents. He noticed her face. He noticed the absence of something. He had sat with her and watched her, and eventually, after the 3rd hospitalization, decided that the absence was information. She told investigators she had felt trapped. She told them she had researched online how to kill someone using antifreeze. She said she hated her husband. The first poisoning was Mark's. He began showing symptoms that Diane described to the doctors when she finally brought him in as seizures and general unwellness. He had been sick for several days before she sought medical attention for him. When investigators later asked why she had waited so long to bring him to the hospital, she told them directly, she hated his guts. She had enough. The medical examiner who examined Mark Staudte in April 2012 found nothing that required further investigation. He had been an overweight man in his 60s with an unhealthy lifestyle. His death was unremarkable on paper. He was buried. After Mark died, Diane used the life insurance payout to buy a new house in a nicer neighborhood. Shaun Staudte was 26 years old and autistic. He lived at home with his mother. He had been close to his father in ways that mattered to him, and the loss of Mark had affected him in ways Diane either didn't notice or didn't factor into whatever calculation she was running. When Diane was asked in the interrogation room why she had killed Shaun, she told Detective Neal McAmis that her son had been worse than a pest. That phrase, worse than a pest, was recorded by the detective and entered into the probable cause statement. It appeared in every document and every news report and every account of the case that followed. It is the sentence that people who follow this case remember most, because it compresses into 4 words a quality of contempt that is difficult to process as something a mother could feel about her own child. Worse than a pest, not worse than she expected, not worse than she could manage, worse than a pest, the language of someone describing an inconvenience that has overstayed its welcome. Shaun died on September 2nd, 2012. His death, too, was attributed to existing medical conditions. He was buried alongside his father, both of them without proper memorials. Diane controlled the arrangements and kept them minimal. Mark's brother, Michael Staudte, later told reporters that the family had found out about Shaun's death from another relative, not from Diane. She hadn't called them. The pattern was becoming visible to people who were paying attention. The pastor was paying attention. But even he waited until a 3rd family member was hospitalized before making the call that changed everything. Sarah Staudte was 24 years old. She was the eldest daughter, the one Diane had decided to kill because she had student loans and wouldn't get a job. That was the reason entered into the record: student loans and unemployment. Sarah had been living at home in a house where her father and brother had already been killed without knowing it. She had watched them die. She had grieved them. She had not known that she was being poisoned too, gradually, over multiple administrations. The antifreeze going into her Coca-Cola in doses that were intended to accumulate toward the same end point they had reached with Mark and Shaun. In June 2013, Sarah collapsed. Diane and Rachel drove her to the hospital. The doctor who examined Sarah found organ failure and a brain bleed and immediately identified the presentation as suspicious. Something was wrong in a way that didn't match any ordinary illness. He ordered specific testing. The ethylene glycol in Sarah's system was detected. The same ethylene glycol that had been present in Shaun's autopsy samples, undetected, until investigators went back and tested specifically for it. On June 11, 2013, the pastor made his call. On June 13th, investigators visited Sarah at the hospital. Detective Neal McAmis of the Springfield Police Department began building the case. He brought Diane and Rachel in separately for questioning. What happened in the interrogation room with Diane Staudte is, for investigators and behavioral analysts who have studied the recorded footage, one of the most striking confession sequences in modern true crime documentation. Not because of the violence, there is no violence in the room. Not because of breakdown or denial, because of the flatness. Diane Staudte sat in the interrogation room with her arms crossed, wearing a floral shirt. Detective McAmis described his own tone later as measured and calm, almost conversational, the kind of questioning that sounds from the outside like two people catching up. He asked her about Mark. He asked her about Shaun. He asked her about Sarah. And Diane Staudte answered. She told him she had hated Mark. She told him she had felt trapped. She told him she had gone online to research how to kill someone using antifreeze. She told him about the tasteless variety ordered specifically to avoid detection. She told him about the Gatorade. That was for Mark, who drank Gatorade. She told him about the Coca-Cola. That was for the children. She told him why she had done each one. The husband. She hated him. She'd had enough. The son. Worse than a pest. The daughter. Student loans. No job. She recited these reasons in the same tone a person might use to explain a home repair decision or a grocery substitution. Not cold in the theatrical sense, not menacing, not predatory, flat. As though the internal process that usually connects actions to their human weight had simply never been engaged. As though the question of why she had poisoned her family was structurally no different from the question of why she had chosen one neighborhood over another when she moved. Detective McAmis asked if she had any regrets. She said she had screwed up her whole family. That was the remorse, not for the deaths, for the disruption to the family unit. The calculation she had been running had produced a result she hadn't intended, or at least a version of the result that had turned out to be more complicated than she'd anticipated. Rachel's confession ran parallel to her mother's, with a different texture. Where Diane was flat, Rachel was chilling in a different way. She told investigators that her mother had brought up the idea first. She told them she had gone along with it. She told them they had chosen antifreeze because they believed it would be hard to detect, which it had been for over a year. She told them about the online research, the specific purchase, the decision-making process, and then investigators found Rachel's diary. It had been hidden in her closet. A journal entry from June 2011, approximately 10 months before Mark Staudte died, read, "It's sad when I realized how my father will pass on in the next 2 months. Shaun, my brother, will move on shortly after." She had written it down in advance, not as a confession, not as a plan written in the language of planning, as a statement of future fact, written in the past tense, as though the deaths were things she had already witnessed in some interior version of events that had not yet happened in the world. She had written the deaths of her father and her brother as events already scheduled, destinations, not decisions. The word sad is in the sentence, not guilt, not hesitation, not the language of someone wrestling with what they were about to do. Sad. The way a person might be sad about a necessary procedure, an unpleasant thing that will nonetheless occur because the alternative is worse. The diary entry proved something that Rachel's confession alone might not have fully established. She had not been a passive participant, pulled along by a domineering mother. She had been present in the planning at a level that expressed itself in private writing, alone, in her own room, in her own words, 10 months before the first death. Whatever the dynamic between Diane and Rachel was, and investigators noted that Rachel was described by people who knew the family as Diane's favorite child, the daughter Diane was closest to. Rachel had internalized the plan as her own reality before it became reality. The diary would become one of the most referenced pieces of evidence in a case that was already overflowing with documentation of the most disturbing kind. Mark Staudte had been a musician. He had played blues. There is no account of him as a violent man, or a dangerous one, or a man who had driven his family to this through something specific that the record has captured. He had been overweight and unhealthy and, in Diane's telling, hateful. Though the word hate, when she used it, seemed to describe not something he had done, but something about the fact of him. He had existed in a way she found intolerable. He had been there. He had been her husband. That had been enough. Shaun had been autistic and had lived at home and had, in his mother's assessment, been worse than a pest. Sarah had student loans. These were the reasons. Not distillations of larger grievances. Not the compressed summaries of decades of documented abuse or documented fear. These were the complete reasons as Diane gave them, as they were entered into the record. And sitting across from Detective McAmis in that interrogation room, Diane Staudte did not behave as though the reasons required defense or explanation or elaboration. They were simply the facts of the situation as she had encountered it. She had felt trapped. She had solved the problem. She was explaining how. Both women eventually pleaded guilty. Diane was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 2016. Rachel, who agreed to testify against her mother as part of a plea arrangement, was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. She would be eligible after serving 42.5 years. In 2022, 9 years after her arrest, Diane Staudte gave an interview from prison that walked back everything she had said in the interrogation room. She told the interviewer that her husband had been involved with dangerous people, that Mark had been associated with individuals who had connections to violence, that someone had probably come in and given him something. She said she had been told in jail that Mark had been, and she used a specific term, green-lighted. None of this had ever been mentioned to police. None of it had been mentioned to her attorneys. There was no evidence in any record to support any of it. Investigators who had worked the case responded simply, "There is no evidence for these claims." The 2013 confession, the one that had been recorded in full, still existed. The interrogation room footage still existed. The diary still existed. The online purchase records still existed. The ethylene glycol in 3 family members still existed. Diane Staudte's 2022 recasting of events had no surface to adhere to. It sat there, unanchored, next to everything that had been documented in the years before. She decided the record needed to be different. Sarah Staudte survived. She left the hospital with physical and neurological damage that is permanent. She had been poisoned by her mother and her sister in a house where her father and brother had already been killed the same way. She had grieved 2 deaths she did not know were murders. She had sat at a table and been handed drinks she did not know were poison. She had watched her family reduce itself around her, one person at a time, and she had not known. She had been driven to the hospital by the 2 people responsible for her condition. Diane and Rachel brought her in, which is either a final calculation about avoiding detection or something more complicated that the record doesn't fully illuminate. She survived. The neurological damage is lifelong. The knowledge of what happened in that house is also lifelong. Both of those things are now hers to carry. The prosecutor, Todd Myers, stood at a podium after the sentencing and said something that has stayed in the public record of this case. He said that Diane and Rachel Staudte had tried to erase Mark and Shaun from their lives. He said that the county had chosen not to erase them from its memory. Mark Staudte was a blues musician. Shaun Staudte was 26 years old and autistic and lived at home with his mother. They were buried without proper memorials in a year when the woman responsible controlled the arrangements. What ended it was not forensic science applied promptly, not an alert system that detected antifreeze in the first toxicology screen, not a neighbor who called in something suspicious, or a family member who recognized the pattern. What ended it was a pastor in a floral Springfield church who sat across from a woman at 2 different funerals and noticed something about her face that he couldn't name, and then saw a 3rd family member hospitalized and finally picked up the phone. He said he believed the deaths needed to be investigated. They did. Inside that house, in ordinary kitchen glasses, in Gatorade and Coca-Cola, in the daily ritual of a family sharing drinks over whatever passed for conversation in the Staudte household, that was where it happened. Not in a dramatic confrontation, not with a weapon anyone would recognize as one, with a bottle purchased online specifically because it was tasteless, and a family that trusted the person pouring. Worse than a pest. Student loans. The reasons were in the record. They have always been in the record. They don't become more comprehensible with time. They just remain there, exactly as Diane Staudte gave them, in a Springfield interrogation room. sitting with her arms crossed and her voice even, explaining a year of poisonings with the affect of someone describing a manageable inconvenience that has finally been resolved.